Thank you for that very warm introduction. I like to walk and talk, so I'm not going to be stuck behind a podium. I'm going to move around a fair bit. Very happy to be here. So pleased to see so many people in attendance to talk about a very important issue, and that is Alberta separatism. This is the schedule for what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the history. I want to talk about what is different now compared to this history. I'm going to look at some of the arguments in favor of separatism and talk about how accurate they are, and some are. Some are also inaccurate, some are mixed. Then I'm going to go through a whole set of polling data, and then we're going to have a set of questions and answers and comments and make it more conversational. So last fall, I taught Alberta politics, as I regularly do, and this is a condensed version of something I'd spend 2 weeks on. But I often begin with the students by saying, when do you think Western alienation, Alberta separatism began? And they would all talk about Justin Trudeau. I said, that's fair enough. Most of them didn't remember any prime minister prior to Justin Trudeau, which made me feel really old. But then some of them would say, you know, my parents would talk about Pierre Trudeau. I said, okay, now we're getting someplace. And then some smart ass would say, it was probably 1905 when Alberta became a province. And sure enough, he was right. So almost from day one, Albertans were angry. And what were we angry about? Well, a couple things. One is this was the Buffalo Territory. It was one area, okay? And they divided us into two provinces. I think about this now and I go, well, thank you. I wouldn't want Regina to be the capital. Sorry to offend anyone from Saskatchewan. But it was divided in two because the Laurier government didn't want a powerful province. And I'm thinking, in 1905, there might have been 40,000 people that lived in Buffalo. Nevertheless, there was a decision to split it. I'm not sure that made it better or worse, but it was a form of antagonism, and this would be a really difficult province to govern. But that was only one issue. The second issue was, well, when they did divide it, okay, they had a choice of making Edmonton the capital or Calgary the capital. Okay? And while I did my PhD at the University of Alberta, and I did spend several years living in Edmonton, I've spent most of my life in Calgary. So obviously I would have chosen Calgary. But what happened is there was a federal election. And the Liberals won the Edmonton seat, and the Conservatives won the Calgary seat. Not that much different, 120 years later. And so Laurier is the prime minister at the time. He is a Liberal. So he appoints a Liberal from Edmonton as the lieutenant governor and says, it's going to be your call to determine where the capital is. Hence, Edmonton. And he also got to choose where the University of Alberta would be. But he didn't choose Edmonton. He chose Strathcona, which is, of course, across the river from Edmonton, and is now part of Edmonton. Okay, we used to, when I was at U of A, we talked about crossing the river to go to the legislature. Okay? So that would be, at least from a Calgarian's point of view, original sin number 2. And it also shows some of the antagonism towards the Liberal Party did not begin in 2015, or in 2025, it might have begun in 1905. But the worst offense, and the one that I think speaks the loudest, was Alberta and Saskatchewan never got natural resource rights, unlike any other province. So from the get-go, we were a second-class province. Now, we got that back in 1930, okay? Interestingly enough, it took a Conservative Prime Minister, R.B. Bennett, to give us that power, okay? So it's been over 100 years, but again, it's an original sin and something that you remember to set the stage. So we have 1905. Okay? Anything happen after that? Well, I'm sure some of you in this room have seen this cartoon, the famous milch cow. This is 10 years later. And it shows that the prairies are providing all of the food for the cow, and the milk goes to Eastern Canada. I do need to pause here on Eastern Canada, okay? Because that's actually Central Canada. Okay? And just to give you an illustration, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we got a new president at Mount Royal University, a man by the name of David Doherty. And David was a political scientist. And David gives his first address to the faculty. And he kept talking about Eastern universities and comparing Mount Royal to these Eastern universities. And he meant Acadia, St. Francis Xavier, Dalhousie. But I had to pull him aside and I said, David, that's Atlantic Canada. When you lived in Waterloo, that was Eastern. When people in Calgary hear East, they mean Toronto. So he corrected himself and he started to refer to Atlantic Canada. The other thing is, we can see that, you know, the prairies are feeding the cow's giving the milk to Central Canada. What no one shows is what the poor people in Atlantic Canada get. So if anyone should feel alienated by Confederation, it should be Atlantic Canada. And this is a nice segue to, there was a book written by Donald Savoy, very prominent public policy political scientist from the University of Moncton. And he wrote a book just a couple of years ago called The Victimization of Canada. And what it meant was every province in this country sees themselves as a victim. Okay? Quebec sees themselves as a victim since the conquest. Atlantic Canada sees them as a victim. I'm going to talk about Alberta feeling as a victim. And you're thinking to yourself, well, obviously Ontario doesn't see themselves as a victim. But of course, Ontario does in comparison to the United States and the United Empire Loyalists. So we have a country of victimhood. That's going to be a theme I'm going to bring through. All right, so that's the 1915s. The CPR, okay, and didn't put this together before I realized I was in a church. So I won't say it, but I'm hoping people can read. So this is from the 1940s, okay? This is well before not just Justin Trudeau, but before Pierre Trudeau, okay? So we're seeing a pattern. It doesn't matter what the issue is. There has been a feeling that Alberta has been hard done by. So let's move closer into the present. This is the 1970s. Again, didn't realize I was in a church. This is well before the National Energy Program. I'm pretty sure this was on a truck, okay? Because there were battles over energy policy with Lougheed and Trudeau that predate the National Energy Program. Okay? Someone gives me this. I've got all sorts of souvenirs. And someone sent me a copy of the State of Alberta passport. Okay? So when we talk about independence, right, this is an old phenomenon. Now, it's a joke. I also have a Quebec passport that was given to me by the PQ leader. It's in French, so I didn't show this. And it's kind of funny, but this was done in the 70s. And there's a whole series of things. It bans French signs, but that's okay. The province is still bilingual, English and Ukrainian. Okay. It talks about what your profession is: farmer, oil man, heritage fund banker, cowboy. Okay. It talks about your description, your height without cowboy boots, your weight without your belt buckle. It lists your dependents: cows, horses, pigs. Notice kids is last. Okay? So it's kind of humorous, but it does show some anger. Okay? And to put it on the record, I am a Federalist, okay? But I have lived in Alberta for a very long time. I used to tell a joke that my parents moved here when the Socreds were still in power, okay? Some of the older people here may actually remember that, okay? It does talk about Alberta staying rat-free, but I can appreciate some of the anger, okay? The next reporter from Toronto who doesn't understand time zones may be pushing me in that direction. Okay. Then we get to the NEP. And bear in mind, today, we don't have much budget secrecy. I was joking, Ms. Johnson was not, about the provincial budget, but it was telegraphed last week by the Premier, right? We have regular fiscal updates. Federally, they're given press conferences well before the advance of the budget. But that's not the way it used to be. Do you know how Peter Lougheed found out about the NEP? Watching it on TV. Okay, no heads up. Okay, and this is a protester. That's a Pierre Trudeau suit, if you're, for the young folks in the audience. Okay. Then we elect a separatist. The only separatist, formal separatist that we've elected from the Western Canada concept. They subsequently lost, but again, we're seeing an evolution. What about the 1990s? How many remember this bumper sticker? And this is from a truck, okay? Defend the West, this is in the Chrétien era. No Kyoto, no wheat board, no gun registry. Well, I can tell you, after the election of Stephen Harper, pulled out of Kyoto, sold off the wheat board, and dismantled the gun registry. So that was accomplished. Then we have the Wexit movement. This emerges in 2019. Justin Trudeau is elected in 2015. He actually has some support in Alberta. They won 4 seats. Now, 4 seats isn't a lot, but for the Liberals, that was a lot. And they won a seat in Calgary, Kent Hare in Calgary Centre, for the first time since 1968. So they made an inroad. Things did not go well the first term of Justin Trudeau. By the time 2019 came around, they lost all of their seats, and they had the lowest voter turnout in support of the Liberal Party in Alberta's history. Now, bear in mind, there are probably more rats in Alberta than Liberals, so that gives you an indication. And so there was a spike in separatism, and they based it off the Brexit movement in Britain, and they called itself Wexit. So there's Jason Kenney. He's Premier. He campaigns against Trudeau, not just in Alberta, but he travels to Ontario. He travels to Manitoba. And Trudeau still wins. So he is concerned by this rise in separatism. Say what you will about Jason Kenney. He is a Federalist, and he has been fighting the separatists for the last several months. So he forms the Fair Deal panel. And the Fair Deal panel took off the shelf a whole series of traditional conservative ideas. An Alberta pension plan, Alberta police force, Alberta tax collection. That was an original firewall letter written by a bunch of Calgary academics and think tank people like Ted Morton, who's later a cabinet minister, Tom Flanagan, who's later campaign manager for Stephen Harper, Ken Bosenkool, who worked in Harper's office, and Stephen Harper himself. Ralph Klein wasn't interested in any of those ideas. He thought they were the dumbest thing he ever heard. Nevertheless, the ideas continued to circulate in conservative circles, so that when there was this spike in separatism, Jason Kenney pulled them off the shelf and said, well, let's revisit this, and he appoints Preston Manning to lead it. So we have a rise in this. What happens after Wexit? Okay. Now we're in the current situation. And so we've seen some separatist parties officially formed, like the Alberta Republicans. We see support for Alberta sovereignty. Okay. We see some support for the United States. And that's kind of the environment that we're in. Now, Pierre Poilievre gave a speech at the Calgary Conservative Convention in January. And he addressed the elephant in the room. He addressed Alberta separatism. And he made the point that separatism is a consequence of the Liberal Party. Now, he's talking about both Quebec separatism and Alberta separatism. In the case of Quebec, that's completely false. They may have had a referendum in 1980 with Pierre Trudeau as Prime Minister, but they began the campaign when Joe Clark was Prime Minister. It's a nonpartisan issue, okay? But in Alberta, we see a spike in separatism when the Liberals are in office. There is a partisan element to it. So the original firewall letter in 2001, in the aftermath of Jean Chrétien's third straight majority government. Then we see Wexit after Justin Trudeau wins re-election in 2019. And then we see the current environment with Mark Carney becoming Prime Minister, okay? I don't believe that we would be going through a separation petition right now if Pierre Poilievre was Prime Minister. So there is a partisan element that you don't see in other parts of the country. So that's kind of the history. And the point of this is that it's a long history. And it's a long set of grievances that have been built up over time. And then what it takes is sort of a focusing event to unleash all of those. And that focusing event was the re-election of the Liberals. Okay. What is different now? If we've had a separatist element for 120 years, what has changed? Okay. I think what has changed is the legislation that has allowed this. So, Jason Kenney introduced citizens' initiative referendums in 2021. Okay? This is a form of direct democracy that says if enough Albertans care about an issue and they sign a petition, it would go to a referendum. Okay? We'd never had that before. Other provinces don't have that before, but some American states do. And it was a policy proposal that the Wild Rose Party used to have, that the Reform Party used to have, and that the Social Credit Party of the 1930s used to have. Okay? But I don't believe that Jason Kenney was a strong believer in direct democracy. I think he liked representative democracy, but he was taking over a merged party. This was a major condition. I think he was checking off a box, but he opened the door. And we also have recall legislation. We've just gone through a whole period of attempted recalls of about 20 MLAs, and they all failed. Okay. Oops. Did the batteries go? There we go. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay. This is what he said. Okay. Basically, those who wanted a referendum on constitutional issue would need to collect signatures from 20% of eligible voters. Okay? And you would have 3 months to do that. Okay? And there was a geographic requirement that you had to have a certain percentage from northern Alberta, from central Alberta, southern Alberta, Calgary, and Edmonton. Last spring, less than a year ago, Danielle Smith makes changes. She makes it easier. Okay? And this was seen at the time to support the separatist movement. And I'll go into more detail about that. So what did she do to make it easier? Oops, why does this keep moving forward? I want to talk about spring, okay? She drops it from 20% of eligible voters to 10% of those who voted in the last election. This is a difference between having to gather 400,000 signatures and 178,000 signatures. That's a significant drop. She extends the timeline from 3 months to 4 months, and she removes the geographic requirement. Okay? This was seen, widely seen at the time, to be supporting the separatist movement led by the Alberta Prosperity Project. Okay? So much so that Indigenous people got really upset. And they said, what about our treaty rights? Our treaties were signed before Alberta was even a province. They were signed with the Crown. Okay? And so the government brought in legislation that said, okay, we're going to make it easier, but at the same time it has to be constitutional and it has to accept treaty rights. So Jeff Rath and Mitch Sylvester put forward their question. They sent it to Elections Alberta. Elections Alberta looks at this and goes, I think this violates treaty rights. I think this violates the Constitution. We're not judges. We're not lawyers. We don't know for sure. So they sent it off to the courts for a reference opinion. So in the fall of 2025, the Smith government amends that legislation again. They get rid of the prohibition of it being constitutional. They get rid of the prohibition about it adhering to treaty rights. But they do a couple other things as well. There had been a procedure that you couldn't ask a similar question within 5 years. Okay? Why that's important is before this legislation passed, Thomas Lacombe had gathered enough signatures under the old legislation. And so that would have prevented the Alberta Prosperity Project from even pursuing their petition. They got rid of that. So we're seeing two examples of making legislative changes to make it easier to allow an opportunity for a separatist petition. And then, after Rath and Sylvester and Modre's question gets approved, they increase the entry fee for starting a petition from $500 to $25,000. So I would argue that there were 3 steps that the Smith government took to make it easier for a separation referendum and to make it harder for any other type of referendum. That is what is different. We've never had that sort of situation. Okay? Nor have we seen this in the country. We've had 2 referendums on separation. Both of those were led by a government, the government of Quebec. They campaigned on separation, they won an election, then they had a referendum. Okay? In this case, the government is not leading the referendum. It's an outside group though with clear ties to the United Conservative Party, and they have made it easier. I would argue there's a number. I am not calling Danielle Smith a separatist. She doesn't call herself a separatist. She has a mantra that says, I support a sovereign Alberta and a united Canada. The problem with that phrase is it really doesn't clarify things. It's like sovereignty association. Okay? What does that mean? And so if you're a separatist, you hear the term sovereign Alberta. If you're a federalist, you hear United Canada. It's complicated. Why is Smith walking that tightrope? I think there's a couple reasons. Reason number 1 is to give herself leverage against Mark Carney. And she said this publicly. You either negotiate with me or you negotiate with Rath, Sylvester, and Modre. Okay? So that's one element. The other is to keep the UCP united. There are separatists within the United Conservative Party. There are federalists within the United Conservative Party. This is a problem because Smith understands that if the UCP splits up into 2 parties, you have a greater chance of the NDP forming government, just as they did in 2015 when there was a vote split between the Wild Rose Party and the PC Party. And Smith was very well involved in that. Okay? So, for the sake of party unity and for the sake of leverage, she is aiding and abetting a separatist party, but at the same time, she did negotiate an MOU with Mark Carney. This is complicated. So much so that I think the best illustration of this tightrope that the Premier is walking was the day that that they had the signing ceremony with Carney. It was in Calgary. They had the flags, they had the photo ops, they had the speeches. That afternoon, Mark Carney goes down to the Chamber of Commerce. There's several thousand well-heeled, politically connected Calgarians who give Carney not one, but two standing ovations. I've been to a lot of events, political events at the BMO Center. You rarely see a standing ovation, let alone to a prime minister, let alone a liberal prime minister. The next day, Danielle Smith goes to Edmonton to her own party's convention. And she is on TV bragging about this MOU that she just signed with Mark Carney. She gets booed on television. So Mark Carney is being cheered, Smith is being booed. Two very different crowds, but still, it shows a tightrope. Okay. Hence the Lukaszuk wrath issue. So, Thomas Lukaszuk, bear in mind, I've known Thomas a long time. He does not like Danielle Smith and has not liked her for a very long time. He announces he's going to get a bunch of signatures. I thought he was a muckraker. I thought he was just being a disturber. But sure enough, he put his elbows down, he built up a team, and they got over 400,000 signatures. And he deliberately chose the old rules, not the new rules, to get ahead of wrath. Because if he had waited for the new rules, there would have been a race to Elections Alberta. In this case, he was trying to get out in front of him to prevent the second referendum because of that 5-year rule, not realizing that there will be possibly 2 referendums. So last Thursday, the Premier announced 9 referendum questions for October 19th. Okay? I've already put it in my calendar. Okay? 5 on immigration, 4 on constitutional change, but she also said the next day at the press conference, there'll probably be a referendum on Rath's question. And she was also asked, well, what about Lukaszuk's? Well, they're going to create a cabinet committee because under the old rules, it didn't automatically go to a referendum. It would go to a resolution in the legislature. And this cabinet committee is going to determine whether there will be a resolution in the legislature or it'll be a referendum. I'm willing to bet my shiny loonie that they're going to make it a referendum question. And the reason for that is, how would the vote go in the legislature on Alberta remaining a province of Canada? I know which way the NDP is going to vote. The UCP, as I said, is split. And I don't know if they're split 50-50. I don't know if they're split 60-40. But they're clearly split. She does not want to see a split in the party. So I've heard people say, well, she's not going to allow a free vote. She'll whip the vote. Great. Which way? So I think they're going to punt it to a referendum. This means on October 19th, after you go through the immigration ballot and you go through the constitutional change ballot, you're going to get a question, should Alberta stay in Canada and should Alberta leave Canada? What if they both pass? Well, if they both pass, then we get a sovereign Alberta in a united Canada. But more seriously, probably political chaos. political chaos. Okay. So that's Lukaszuk versus Rath. All right. Now I want to walk through the arguments that the separatists make. And the one is 10 years of Justin Trudeau. Okay? And you hear this. And in fact, at that same federal conservative convention, Danielle Smith also spoke. And she gave a firebrand speech. She's an incredible communicator. And she talked about the 10 years of the Liberal government, and Justin Trudeau, and Stephen Guilbeault, and Jagmeet Singh. And the audience booed Trudeau. And they booed Singh, and they really booed Stephen Guilbeault. Except, she never mentioned Mark Carney. And the Liberals haven't been in office for 10 years. They've been in office 11 years. Okay? And why has she not done that? Because she signed an MOU with the Liberals, and they're working with the Liberals. But the larger point is, if you were here at the beginning, separatism didn't start in 2015. There's a long history of this, right? So it's not all Justin Trudeau's fault. And 30 years from now, when Xavier Trudeau is Prime Minister, we're going to have this again. All right. The second is, we need to separate to get a pipeline built. Okay? We need to get a pipeline built. Well, we need to talk about Trans Mountain. Trans Mountain did not win any favors to Justin Trudeau. He probably lost, I know he lost political support in BC. He didn't gain any credit in Alberta. During the 2019 campaign, wherever Trudeau went, you would have a group of demonstrators going, "You're destroying the Alberta oil sector." And then you'd have another group of environmentalists going, "You bought the Alberta oil sector a pipeline." I think he did it for, dare I say, the good of the country. And the pipeline was very expensive, well over budget, took a long time to build, okay? But it got built, and it is now making money, lots of money. So much so that the BC government, who fought it over and over again, are now arguing that we should expand the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Ironically, the only politician who is now supporting the Trans Mountain Pipeline is David Eby. You don't hear Trudeau talking about Trans Mountain. Danielle Smith doesn't talk about Trans Mountain. Rachel Notley doesn't talk about Trans Mountain. Jason Kenney doesn't talk about Trans Mountain. It's an orphan pipeline because of all the controversy. But what I will say is, despite all of that controversy, it is functioning, it is bringing in money, it is giving us a different market than the United States, and this would never have happened if Alberta was a separate country. It took a lot of elbow grease, it took a lot of work to force that through using federal supremacy, because interprovincial pipelines are federal jurisdiction. Would any future government do all of that on behalf of a separate country? I don't believe it would. So that's pipelines. Anti-energy policy, we could rattle those off. I'm probably sure some of you in the room have them memorized. Electric vehicle mandate, emissions cap, tanker ban, Impact Assessment Act, plastics ban. Okay? Well, those have all been addressed in that MOU between Carney and Smith. It was a grand bargain, and a grand bargain, I think, that this is something that Kenney wanted, that Notley wanted, that Jim Prentice wanted, and Smith got it. I think it was a big win for Smith. I think it was also a big win for Mark Carney. Now, they had opposite views. All right? Smith's view was to support the Alberta oil and gas sector. Carney's view is to diversify the economy away from the United States. So they reached this grand bargain. There's still a lot of work at play. There's still a lot of work at play. But a lot of those anti-energy policies, I believe, have been dealt with. Okay? Equalization. We had a referendum on equalization. It passed with over 60%. Nothing happened. Okay? There's a lot of confusion about equalization. It is a federal program. It's tax money. Nate Horner doesn't get up and write a check to Manitoba or Quebec or Nova Scotia, right? This is tax money that goes into Ottawa that goes to different provinces to have a degree of similar social services. Okay? Albertans will never receive equalization because we are by far the richest province in Canada. For us to receive equalization, our per capita GDP would have to drop $40,000, $50,000, have the equivalent of Nova Scotia. So if you want to get out of equalization, that's a way to do it. I wouldn't suggest doing it. And let's be clear, when we talk about equalization, we're not talking about money to PEI. And we're not talking about money to Manitoba. We're not even talking about Saskatchewan, who used to receive equalization for decades. It's about Quebec, right? It's about money to Quebec. And so that is a major argument. But it's a minor amount of money. There's other fiscal transfers, but the equalization program is a red flag, but it's not a huge difference. So maybe we change the formula and we throw in Quebec's hydro. It doesn't change it all that much. It's a very complicated formula. There's probably only a dozen people in the country that really understand it. Thankfully, one is Trevor Toome from the University of Calgary, and he can explain it. But it's a powerful argument for separatism, but unless you start walking through it, then I think it starts to minimize. And it's not as significant as they make it out to be. Okay? Now we get away from the economy, away from economic arguments to political arguments. Alberta is underrepresented in the House of Commons. Alberta is underrepresented in the Senate. And so this is a table I produced. Alberta is the one in the red, so it's easier to see. And if we just look at the House of Commons, yes, Alberta does not have as many seats in Parliament as it should. Instead of having 37, it should probably have 40. It should have 41. And you can see our population's 11.8%. Our House seats are 10.78%. So like 1% less. But we're not the only province that's underrepresented. BC is even more underrepresented at 1.3. And the largest province that is most underrepresented is Ontario. So if you want true representation by population, what you're arguing for is for Ontario to gain more seats. Okay? And as far as the provinces that are overrepresented, they have more seats than they probably deserve, it's everyone else. And no, it's not just Quebec. Quebec, it's marginal. It's 0.7. Okay? Instead, it's Nova Scotia, it's PEI, it's Manitoba, it's Saskatchewan. So yes, we are slightly underrepresented. And rep by pop is not perfect. We also have discrepancies between rural and urban seats. Is breaking up the country for the sake of 3 or 4 House of Commons seats important? I don't think it is. The Senate, we're screwed in the Senate. The entire Western Canada is underrepresented because the original Constitution divides the Senate not equality by province, but equality by region. Except Ontario is its own region, Quebec is its own region, then we have Atlantic Canada, and we have Western Canada. Well, there are more people in Alberta than all of Atlantic Canada combined times 2. They have 24, sorry. They actually have 30 because of Newfoundland, okay? We have 6. This is wrong. And this is why Senate reform has been a major talking point in the province of Alberta. Okay? Bert Brown drove Triple E into his field. And we reached an agreement, a constitutional agreement, for the Triple E Senate in 1992 in the Charlottetown Accord. And the country voted that down in a referendum, including Albertans. There is a current proposal to abolish the Senate. That's one of the referendum questions on October 19th. I think that's something we could work with the other provinces. Okay? But here's something to keep in mind. Senate isn't all that powerful. It's not. Okay? And so is, again, breaking up the country worth it because we don't like an institution that underrepresents us that has no power? Okay. And no, I'm not advocating to be a senator, although it's a great job. Jean Chrétien, for years, tried to appoint Jean Beliveau to the Senate. And Jean Beliveau told the Prime Minister, Mr. Prime Minister, thank you, that's a great honor, but I'm really busy. I've got this going on, I've got that going on. And Chrétien looks at Beliveau and goes, I don't think you understand what being a senator is. Okay, so that's the Senate. So those are some political arguments, okay? COVID. I think there is a clear connection between opposition to public health restrictions over COVID and separatism. All you have to do is look at the movement led by Take Back Alberta and David Parker to remove Kenney from office, as they did in May of 2022. It was over COVID. David Parker is now mobilizing for separatism. Okay? Clear connection. And when you hear people talk about the importance of separatism, they're talking about the Emergencies Act, they're talking about the Ottawa Convoy. Okay? So something happened during COVID, which is why I've got that book project. Okay? I keep trying to get it finished with Lisa, and then stuff keeps happening, and we have to add another chapter. But the politics of COVID have not disappeared, and I would put separatism as part of that. We have immigration. Okay. Canada, unlike other industrialized democracies in the West, used to have a consensus around immigration, okay? At least since the Second World War. Okay? But the surge in immigration post-COVID, 2022, 2023, 2024, really caused a collapse of that consensus. And we're seeing that playing itself out today. Even though when you look at immigration rates between 2015 and 2026, it is less as a percentage of the population than what existed between 2006 and 2015. Because people don't look back to 2015 or 2016 or 2017. There wasn't much immigration in 2020 and 2021 because of COVID, but then this whole group coming in. And there is a connection there. And there is a racial component to it. You go to some of the APP rallies, it doesn't take long for immigration to come up in some very nasty terms. We're going through a referendum process with 5 questions on immigration. And I think there's a connection between that and separatism. Issues of gun rights, okay? Issues of transgender rights and gay rights, issues of crime. Those are all been used as arguments in favor of separatism. And I think we can go into that in more detail in the Q&A. But what I will say is it's not one issue. And it reminds me of Jacques Parizeau, who was the Premier of Quebec in 1995 during the referendum, and he used to describe separatism as a magic wand that would solve all problems. And I think that's what Alberta separatism is. It's a magic wand that will solve whatever that grievance is. Okay? It will solve the immigration grievance. It will solve the crime grievance. It will solve the equalization grievance. It will solve the pipeline grievance. It will ensure that a separate Alberta wins a gold medal in hockey. Like, it doesn't matter, right? And it makes it tough to argue against that when the targets keep moving. All right, let's look at some polling. Okay. A couple interesting things here. This is from an Angus Reid poll a couple weeks ago. Okay. And the interesting thing that they asked, and this is a large N, so a large number of surveys, almost 1,000, where do you get your information? For those that want to stay in Canada, it's mainstream media. Global, CTV, CBC, the Herald, Globe and Mail. Okay. For those who want to leave, it's alternative media. Western Standard, Rebel Media, Juno News, conversation with friends and family, events hosted by APP. I don't think a whole lot of stay people go to those events. That may explain some of that. But what this tells us is it's a vacuum. It's two groups of people talking to two different groups of people, watching different news coverages. It's not a common theme. It's tough to talk with each other in that respect. Okay. Here's a couple other polling things. Alberta's not alone. This is a comparison with Manitoba and Saskatchewan about whether we're respected in Canada. Okay. Alberta's higher than Saskatchewan. It's higher than Manitoba. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the other is it has dropped. In other words, there was more anxiety about Alberta's place in Canada in 2019 than today. What explains then the separatism movement today compared to 2019? I think the difference is the provincial government. How much influence? Remember I said everybody in Canada sees themselves as a victim? Okay. How much influence? Well, here actually Ontario does say that they might have some influence. But everybody else says that they don't. It's like being a large family. Okay. I only had 2 other brothers, but I can tell you my parents favored them more than me. And if Kevin or Brian was here, they might say the exact same thing. That my mom favored me and not them, okay? So Alberta's not that much different. What about money? Same sort of thing, okay? Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, Alberta, New Brunswick. Like, we all believe that the federal government is favoring other provinces, except maybe Ontario. Okay. Here's where things start to get interesting. When we break it down by partisanship, we see a clear difference. We see it in Saskatchewan, we see it in Manitoba, and we see it in Alberta. If you support the NDP, okay, you believe that you're better off in Canada and more respected in Canada than if you're a conservative, whether that's the Sask Party, the PCs of Manitoba, or the United Conservative Party. This is 2025 status. Okay? We do talk about joining the United States. That's a very small number, single digits. Okay? Remaining as individual provinces of Canada, vast majority. Okay? Vast majority. Okay. Now, Alberta's a bit lower, but not that much lower. Okay. Same sort of thing, it plays itself out here based on partisanship. This is vote to leave. So what we have at the top is hard separatists who would leave today, tomorrow, yesterday. They would leave whether it was a conservative or a liberal, is 8%. I've heard it's higher. Janet has done polling that shows it's around 15%, 16%. Okay? Then we have what are called the soft separatists that might consider leaving, okay? That they do have grievances or they want to send Ottawa a message. Okay? Then we have those that are leaning towards staying, and then there's definitely staying. So you can see the intensity there between 8% and 57%. So the hardcore is anywhere from 8 to 15%. You throw in the soft, now you're talking 30, maybe maximum of 35. Okay? They're not going to win a referendum with those numbers. Now, stuff can happen in a referendum, but you're still looking at a 70-30, 65-35. That does not mean there's no problem. If you have 500,000, 600,000, 400,000 Albertans who are so angry that they are willing to vote yes in a referendum, that's a problem. And that's not just a problem for an Alberta government, that's a problem for a national government. And we need to figure that out. Okay? You're never going to get to zero, but I think there are ways that the government, the federal government and the provincial government can take this from a 70-30 question to a 90-10 question or an 85-15 question. Would you leave Alberta if they separated? Never believe this sort of question in a poll. Think about how many people told pollsters in the United States that they were moving to Canada if Donald Trump got elected. Did you see 10 million people crossing the border? Maybe in Roxborough in Quebec. Okay. But there are going to be some. There are going to be some. And that's a problem for Alberta as well. Or people not moving to Alberta, and that's a problem. Just look at what population happened in Quebec in the 1970s and how many left Quebec and how many businesses left Quebec. Right. Who is handling the issue of separatism the best? Who would have picked Mark Carney? Or Jason Kenney? I think that's the highest I've seen a polling number for Jason Kenney in a long time. Okay. But Pierre Poilievre, Daniel Smith, the Prosperity Project, those are pretty stark looking numbers. Okay. Approval of how Smith is handling it. Okay. And you can see, even within the United Conservative Party, there's a split there in how she's handling it. And now, that split is due, I think, to some going, she should be stronger federalist, or she should be a stronger separatist. So both sides are slightly unhappy. The NDP is largely unified. All right, what is our time? Oh, we've gone an hour. All right, I will go to my last slide then. Oops, if I can. Yeah, so this is some of Janet's tracking, and you can see, oops. All right, none of this is working. All right. Oop. Yeah, if you can put it on the slide that has the pictures of the people.
If you point it this direction, it'll work.
This way? To you? Or this way? To you? The one with the pictures of the 5 people. There we go. All right. So Janet Brown and her colleague John Santos, she actually spoke to my class this morning, and she segmented this. So in her polling, she showed 22% committed separatists. So she named that person Luke, Alberta. Okay. Then we have another category called soft separatists. These are people who might vote for separatism. They have some anger with Ottawa, but they're convincible. Then we have conservatives who don't want to separate at all. Then we have centrists who don't want to separate. And then we have left-wingers who don't want to separate. Now, both Megan and Luke, you're not going to convince them. You're not going to be able to convince them to separate. You're not going to convince them to stay. Okay? The rest could be moved, depending on how a campaign operates, depending on the messaging that you use, depending on the arguments that you use, depending on the response of the the federal government. Okay? And I think that's the last message I want to get across. So if you are a very strong federalist who are trying to convince your friends to stay in Canada, you're not talking to Luke, but you can talk to Ethan. Likewise, if you're a committed separatist, you're wasting your time talking to Megan, but you might be able to talk to Sanjeev. Okay? And I will leave it there. There's a lot of you. We have some mics here. I don't know who's distributing the mics, and we will try to do some question and answer. And this is not like question period, where I'll actually try to answer the question.
Somebody's going to have a question.
Oh, we got one at the back there. Go ahead, sir.
So I'm just dying to know how much of this separatism could be equated to, like Brexit. You talked about Brexit and Brexit, but we've seen this trend across the entire globe with various movements. And so are we kind of following on that, or why besides the Trudeau government, why do we want to do this?
So there's a long history of that, and I think that's what we got in there. And so why now? I don't think it's because of the movements in the US or in Britain. I think there's some influence there, but I think why now is these are ongoing issues. We had the re-election that people did not believe was going to happen. The 2025 election, Pierre Poilievre had a 25-point lead in January of 2025, and then lost the election. So I think that's the second. And I think the final one is we have a provincial government, we have a premier for the first time, and I'm not going to call her a separatist, but she's at least separatist adjacent. We've had lots of premiers fight Ottawa. Peter Lougheed fought Ottawa. Jason Kenney fought Ottawa. Ralph Klein fought Ottawa. None of them would have supported this. And I think those are the reasons. When you look back to the steps that were taken, the legislative steps, okay, I think that is why. So less international, much more domestic focus. Although I do think it's not a British influence, there's an American influence here. And maybe we can get an opportunity to talk a bit about that American influence.
My question is concerning the Prime Minister. Now, our Prime Minister, when Justin Trudeau was in power, he advised Trudeau on a lot of issues. That's pretty well known. And also, Carney, Prime Minister Carney, when he was running for office, he mentioned that China was one of the greatest problems for Canada's national security.
Mm-hmm.
Yet now his government is jumping up or leading up toward China.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Okay. First of all, he was listed as an advisor. I don't know what sort of advisory role he actually played with Justin Trudeau. I see them as very different. Trudeau once said he doesn't really think much about monetary policy. Okay. I think Carney only thinks about monetary policy. On the issue of China, I think there's a couple things at play there. One is there were domestic pressures for Carney to get a deal with China. Those domestic pressures came from the prairies. They came from canola farmers in Alberta. Scott Moe went to China. Wab Kinew thanked Carney for the deal. Doug Ford did not, right? So you have a prime minister with most of his seats in Ontario, his own seat in Ottawa, seeming to support Western Canada versus the United States. And he's not the only leader to go to China. Keir Starmer has, okay? Other leaders have. Merz from Germany is going. It's not about China, it's about the United States, okay? There is no way a Canadian Prime Minister would have gone to China, made that deal with China in the absence of Donald Trump. And that would be my comment on China. And I would also say when Carney spoke in Davos, and he was talking about great powers using economic leverage, everyone thought he's talking about the Americans, he's talking about Trump. And he was also talking about the Chinese. And what has he done since that speech? He is helping to broker a trade deal between the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Vietnam, Mexico, Canada, Japan, and the European Union and the British. Why can Canada do that? Because we have a trade agreement with the Europeans and we're part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And most importantly, who is not part of the EU and the TPP? China and the United States. So those would be my response to your comments about Mark Carney.
Hi there. I think it would be extremely educational if we could see a series of open, public, respectful debates between both sides of this issue. I can personally make that happen. I know people across the street who would love to talk to you in a very respectful manner, specifically for Scott. I think it would be great to see two of you discussing like adults in front of a crowd like this, the two sides of the coin. Are you willing to make that happen?
In a neutral environment, I would not have a problem I would not have a problem doing that. I speak to a lot of places. I speak to a lot of forums. I'm a public figure. I don't have a problem with doing that in a respectful fashion. I don't want to be walking into a lion's den.
No, of course, of course. My friend Vince Byfield tried to arrange a public debate where he was going to handpick and make sure that half the audience was conservative, half the audience was liberal, and he still couldn't get a liberal to show up.
Okay.
So, if you can give me a business card or something like that, talk to me afterwards.
Yep, come and see me after. I'll give you my card and, yep.
The question that I have is on the number of referendum questions that came up.
Yep.
I'm fully supportive that we have to have a referendum in terms of separation. I mean, it's just there's too much activity around it. But what are your thoughts on the 8 additional? That's where I came up with that. That's what rubbed me the wrong way, not the separation issue, but the 8 additional ones that were not brought up from the people.
Yep.
And rallied together to get support and stuff. They were just things that were just put onto this referendum. And I will say, I don't even know how it happened. I got it in my work email. It was a bunch of questions from the UPC. And so I was going to answer them. And it was, do you support this? Do you support that? Do you support? And honest to God, I could not answer the questions.
Yeah.
Even though I'm pretty sure what I support and what I don't.
Yeah.
I'm pretty clear on it. I couldn't cipher out the questions.
Yeah.
It wasn't clear what it was asking. My fear is, if that's what the referendum questions are going to be like, who's going to do those questions?
Yeah.
And are people going to go to the polls and not understand
Okay. So, between 1905 and October 18th, 2026, Alberta has had referendums. 6. 6. And 3 of them were on daylight savings time. So this is rare that we have a referendum. And we are going to have 9 from the government and probably 2 from the separatist sides. Okay, 10 or 11 questions. That's a lot. And what I can tell you in the feedback I've been hearing since Thursday's address is separatists are mad and federalists are mad. And one of the reasons the separatists are mad is under the Clarity Act, which the Chrétien government brought in after the 95 referendum, which basically, to summarize, you have a right to secede with a clear question and a clear majority. There's an obligation for negotiations. Okay? The question that the APP has put forward is a pretty clear question. What a clear majority is, they never defined in the legislation, and the Supreme Court never said. That's an issue, that's a problem, and the problem with it, and I can understand how the courts thought, is once we put a number in, right, and we say it's 65%, what if it's 64.8, right? The problem is, what does a clear majority mean? It means something to different people. On the clear question, the question remains clear, but what happens if you put it on a ballot with 9 other questions? Now it's not clear anymore. Yeah, and so that's a problem. Now, we did know that there were going to be referendums in 2026 out of Alberta Next. We knew that. That was the promise. She said that when she created the panel, when the final report came out, and she promised a question on immigration. Not 5. I was surprised that there were 5 questions. I thought there would be a question along the lines of, should Alberta negotiate an immigration deal with Canada just like Quebec? As soon as you put in just like Quebec, you know it'll pass, right? But now you've got 5. And I don't know how the results are going to go. The other thing is all the other referendums we've done have all been in conjunction with an existing election, like a municipal election. This is a standalone. Okay? Are they going to campaign on behalf of these questions? Don't know. It's going to be very, and you're going to get a ballot with 9 or 10 questions. You're going to have to peel them off because they have to be counted separately by hand as well, right? This is going to be a complicated process. And my other fear, just as even having a discussion around separatism is going to be divisive, okay? Let alone a referendum on separation. You now throw in 5 referendum questions on immigration, it's going to be even more divisive. Okay? I'm looking around the room here, I'm seeing a lot of white skin. That's not an offense, because I'm pretty darn white myself, but I can tell you the city of Calgary's not. Okay? City of Calgary is about 40% visible minority. And if you go to Northeast Calgary, it's not 40%, it's 75%. Right? This is going to be a problem. And it's going to be a long 8 months, right? And it's going to be a long ballot. And if you had 4 questions, that's one thing. If you have that many questions, and I'm wondering what the strategy is. So I'm just going to throw this idea out. Based on the polling that I showed, it's doubtful that a separation referendum would pass. But Smith wants some sort of leverage with Ottawa. So it's like you walk into a car dealership. Sir, would you like to buy a Corvette? I can't afford a Corvette. Well, what about a Chevy? Well, maybe I could afford. What about a used car? Right? So maybe you don't want separation, but maybe you want to abolish the Senate. Maybe you want to put restrictions on immigration. Right? Now you're getting a sliding scale. Or are people who favor the government, are they just going to go yes? And people who don't like the government just going to go no? We don't know. We've never been in this atmosphere before. We've never been in a situation with that many referendum questions. Okay. There we go.
Well, I do want to ask my question, but before I do that, I have to give you a bit of background. That's okay. I grew up in the Duplessis era in Quebec, and that was before 1970s, you know.
Okay.
And French mother, grew up French, English father. Great advantage of having an English father. What I saw in those days was the Catholic Church and the large industries working very closely together. And I saw, and I still think that the cause of separatism in Quebec was basically that. That's how I feel.
Yeah.
So then I left Quebec and I came here, U of A gave me a PhD, and I made a career in Alberta, and I'm happy to be here. But now I see the same kinds of things happening, but I'm wondering, what is the really fundamental things behind this? Is it power, money, or do they want to be Americans?
I think it's money, right? I listed a whole bunch of things. I think it's money. And once, at least in the short run, we're going to be poorer than we are going to be richer. Now, it's perhaps 10 years away. After you've settled all that, then everything falls in line. But you're going to have to build all sorts of brand new institutions. There's going to be a degree of uncertainty, all those sorts of things. Quebec is willing to pay that price. Okay? When I talk about equalization, what people tend to forget about Quebec is it also has the highest taxes in Canada. Like Albertans, we have a love-hate relationship with Quebec. We hate their dominance in the federal government, but we love their knife-at-the-throat strategy. We want to be just like Quebec, except having to speak French and paying high taxes. Okay? But they're willing to do that because it's about language. You still have, things have completely changed in Montreal since the 1970s, but you still have the stories of not being served in French at Eaton's, right? Those memories still last, or the dominance of the French, of the Catholic Church, even though Quebec has gotten very secular, much more secular. But it's about language, it's about culture, it's about tradition. That's not going away. The history of Quebec separatism did not start in 1976, right? You can go back to the 19th century, the Plains of Abraham. Alberta is different. And if it's about money, are you willing to lose money in the short run or even longer run? I think that's why the polls are different. Now we're hearing there could be another referendum in Quebec. I heard Plamondon speak at the U of C, very charismatic speaker, very likely to be the next premier of Quebec. But the PQ has been elected before and it hasn't been able to win referendums. And if he forms government, it will be with 37, 38% of the vote. I wouldn't want to go into a referendum with 38% of the vote myself. So I think those are some of the big differences between Quebec and Alberta, and I'll give you one more. So about 2 weeks ago, I kept hearing from the Alberta separatists that the Federalists weren't making a positive case for Canada. It was all fear-mongering, or you can't do it because of treaty rights, or you can't do it because of Clarity Act, or you won't be able to build a pipeline. They said, nobody writes about what the positive case is. So I took that on. I said that I've spent most of my life in Alberta, but I've got family in Ontario. Most people have family outside of Alberta. Most have friendships outside of Alberta. Francophones in Quebec don't have those relationships outside of Quebec because of that language barrier. I think that is different. There is an attachment to Canada that I think is stronger in Alberta than it will be in Quebec, and it's because of those ties. Whether you're from Newfoundland, or whether you've retired in BC, or whether you've come from Saskatchewan, you go to a Stampeders game when they're playing the Riders, okay, the stands look like a Christmas tree. It's all red and green, okay? And so I think that's a big difference as well.
One more?
Oh, we already have someone with the mic. Yep, you get the last word. Or actually the second last. Oh, second last, okay.
Second last word. We talk about the fact that the polls are in our favor. I'm thrilled. Against separatism. But let's just flip the coin and say that for some crazy reason, the majority of Albertans come out and they vote
Yep.
for separatism. A lot of the things I'm trying to read about is, I'm trying to understand how they can do that. So I'm asking you if you could address some of it, i.e. the fact that the railroads, the national parks, the airports are all federal. Aren't they impinging on Indigenous rights? Don't the Indigenous people have something to say about that? So could you please address if you can do this, but is it really possible?
Okay.
Even if we have the numbers?
Okay, so if you got the numbers and you could imagine Federalists looking at that polls and going, I don't need to show up on that referendum day, right? There's a much higher degree of intensity amongst the separatist minority than there is the Federalist majority, right? Things can change during an election campaign, right? I expect that you're going to see an intervention by Donald Trump into the referendum. You're going to wake up one morning, okay, or me in the middle of the night, and there'll be some Truth Social post going, from Trump going, I've decided I don't want Canada as the 51st state. They're a bunch of suckers and losers. I only want Alberta, right? It's not out of the plausibility. So if I remember having a discussion with the High Commissioner from Britain to Canada 2 weeks before the Brexit vote. And he's adamant that there's no way they're winning. And they did, right? So once you have an election, did I mention the 2025 Canadian election? Right? Things happen, okay? But then we go to the negotiations. We'll even assume that a clear majority is 50% plus one, okay? It's going to be hard negotiations. Who does get the national parks, okay? If Alberta can pull out of Canada, could Calgary pull out of Alberta, right? And I say this seriously because this was one of the debates that was going on in Quebec. Could the island of Montreal secede from Quebec in the event of that? We have Indigenous treaty rights which were signed before Alberta became a province, and they were signed with the Crown, okay? And they were to last as long as the river flows and the sun shines. That's a long time, right? National debt, national assets, right? So imagine you've got a married couple. They've been married for 25 years. They decide to get divorced. They got 2 kids and a dog, and maybe $1 million worth of assets, a house and some other things. Those are difficult negotiations, divorce negotiations, okay? Now, instead of a couple, you have 40 million children. I don't know how many dogs, okay? And you don't have $1 million worth of assets. You have trillions of dollars in assets. So just to take one small example, the Alberta pension plan. How much is it worth? I'm hearing numbers, we might get $315 billion, or we might get $150 billion. That's a pretty big range. $150 billion difference, that's a lot of money. You can't even wrap your head around that, okay? $150,000, we'd be fighting, let alone 150. So it would be a very, very difficult negotiations because of all of these elements at play. And that's why there is a duty to negotiate, but to just say, well, we don't like the negotiations, we're going to declare independence, okay? You still have all of those issues. Even if you don't want to negotiate, they still exist, right? So it would be difficult. Most countries don't have this sort of procedure. There's no procedure to secede from the United States. They tried that once, right? But here's the other thing. I'm hearing the line, David Eby said it, you know, calling supporters of separatism traitors. You're not going to hear me say that. They are not traitors. They are passionate in their beliefs. I think they're wrong, but I wouldn't call them traitors. And if you tell them that they are, and that there's no political process to leave, you know what you get instead? A violent process. You know what ended the FLQ in Quebec and the terrorist attacks? Throughout the 1960s, let alone the October crisis, it wasn't sending in the army. It was the creation of the Parti Québécois, because it gave a legitimate, peaceful mechanism to lead. And if you remove that peaceful mechanism, what's your alternative? And I don't want to see that. So.
One more.
Quick, after the referendum, so if it's an all yes to staying in Canada or an all no, will, or let's say it's all yes, is that going to change the course? And I may think of it as more like a terrible illness that has you in emergency versus a cold sore that you have since 1905, but it just pops up more and more every once in a while. Will the referendum quell things, or will it be over, or will it just be perpetual at a higher rate from now on?
Okay, I'll give you a couple illustrations on that. 1980, the Quebec referendum, it went 60-40. And in his concession speech, René Lévesque said something along the lines of, if I'm hearing you correctly, what I'm hearing is not yet. Not yet. And 15 years later, they had another referendum that was less than 50,000 vote difference. So what I will say is if you get a yes, it ends that. You get a no, it perpetuates that. Right? They're, again, to use a really corny Quebec joke, if at first you can't secede, try and try again. Okay? But once you say yes, then I don't think there is a second opportunity, right? And we saw that with Brexit. Brexit was an economic disaster for Britain. Okay? Any economist will be able to show that. Not only that, it has raised the stakes of a Scottish separatism, and in fact inflamed tensions in Northern Ireland that they thought they had buried with the Good Friday Agreements of 1997. So if there is a no, you could definitely have another referendum because we've had issues of separation for 125 years. If you get to yes, it's going to be very difficult. I think you've let that genie out of the bottle. Okay? But again, as a political scientist, not a historian, it's easier to predict the past than it is to predict the future.